one of the best ways we can grow our students as writers is to help them develop a better vocabulary. So in this episode, I'm talking to Michelle Sullivan, and she's going to share what she's learned not only in her LETRS training, but her years as a literacy coach, and how you can incorporate vocabulary into reading and writing instruction to help your students be better writers. I was really excited to hear some of these tips that she shared because they are really simple and can be used in any classroom. And we're not just talking about kinder through second grade, we're also talking about upper elementary and strategies that we can use to build vocabulary beyond that. Hi, Michelle. Welcome on the podcast.
Hey, April. Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, I'm so excited that you're here to talk about vocabulary and why that's so fundamental to high quality writing, because I think vocabulary is something that we often forget about, especially with our focus on phonics and fluency. We kind of forget about vocabulary and writing. So if you want to just give us a quick introduction to who you are, what you do, and why this topic is interesting to you, that would be great.
Sure. So my name is Michelle Sullivan, and I have background as a literacy coach and reading interventionist. And really for over the past decade of my career, I have been in the literacy realm. So I eat, breathe, sleep, all things literacy. And really it's my mission to help teachers who have to tackle social studies and math and all the things, have that, science of reading bestie to lean into. For some literacy advice. And vocabulary in particular, that is one of my favorite things to talk about, because I feel like in the science of reading community, a lot of people talk about phonics, right? And we know it's not just about phonics. So let's talk about the other side of the rope and how vocabulary is so fundamental to high quality writing. We're going to get a little philosophical here. Think for a second, what is writing exactly? It's your language written down. It's your expressive language, to be more precise. And it's a mode of communicating. And since the beginning of civilization, we've been communicators. And before a writing system was ever even developed, way back in ancient Sumer, we were storytellers. And it's in our nature to share and exchange information and ideas with one another. And let's just think common sense wise, right? If we're conveying ideas to someone, whether it's through speech or through writing, we not only want to grab people's attention, but we want to hold to their attention. And how do we do that? We have to use interesting vocabulary. So let's bring this to life. If I wanted to convey April likes writing, it's a simple idea, but which is more compelling? April likes to write, or April finds joy in crafting vivid stories, often losing herself in the rhythm of her words as she brings her imaginative ideas to life on a page, right? The first does the job, but the second sentence is what moves you. It paints a picture. And when we have that notion that we write with an audience in mind, having your strong vocabulary just allows writers to express their thoughts more precisely and accurately, which ultimately just helps us produce the highest quality writing.
I love that example. Thank you so much for that. I completely agree. We know that most of our readers and writers start with oral storytelling, and they're such great storytellers. And then as we move into having them write words and sentences, that's where sometimes I think we lose that vocabulary, because we're focusing on what phonics skills they have and what spelling patterns they know. So we're getting real simple sentences. So I think it's definitely important for teachers to keep in mind that yes, we need those foundations, and but that oral storytelling is so rich that we can help our students, even the younger ones, have rich writing that matches that oral storytelling. We just need to help them with those skills.
Absolutely.
So can you talk a little bit about what it might look like in the kinder and first grade classroom if you're trying to help students build a rich vocabulary and put that into their writing?
Yeah, so I think broadly speaking, right, we know that our vocabulary consists of all the words that we know in the world, right? All the language that we use in order to communicate our thoughts. And this can be broken down into receptive vocabulary, the words we read and listen to, or our expressive vocabulary, how we speak and how we write. And when we think about that readability piece or engagement piece, it all goes back to audience and expressing our vocabulary with our audience in mind. And when we think about our language systems, We have a sound system, a spelling system, a sentence structure system. But we also have a system called pragmatics. And etymologically, this talks about the practical use of language in our the way we communicate. So it's our rules and conventions in choosing the language that's most practical in a particular situation or scenario. So it's the difference between saying to my husband, like, hey, scooch over, waving my hands at him on the couch, or to a stranger at a restaurant saying, excuse me, sir, would you mind making some more room? So our vocabulary development allows us to be flexible to use pragmatics more effectively. And students are going to speak differently to their friends than they would to their teacher and hopefully the principal, right? So this should translate to our discourse too, as our writing, as well as our writing. And globally speaking, written communication just tends to be more formal than spoken, unless you're texting. But having this broader, deeper vocabulary just allows that flexibility to engage with our audience more effectively, which can just help that whole communication lines. And when we're thinking about our littles, it all stems with that oral storytelling. We want to use the most interesting words that we can from the very beginning, because they are like little sponges and they will soak it all up. And giving them rich experiences with language, and right away being able to tap into applying that in written form too, even if they can't spell it properly, because not everything has to be perfect in kindergarten.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think that sometimes we do focus too much on what can our students actually spell correctly. So what kind of words can they use with what we've already taught them? Whereas I'd be totally fine and happy to see real rich vocabulary, even if it was a little bit harder to read in kindergarten or first grade, because, they don't really know how to spell it. But I want to see them making that attempt. So what does it look like when we're looking at upper elementary then, if we're really focusing on supporting our students and getting a richer vocabulary from them in their writing? And now that they have some of those spelling skills and they can write clear, and we're not so worried about those simple sentences anymore.
Yeah. So I feel like this is always the age-old question for a lot of teachers looking at their data. Like, they're thinking, oh, this student has a quote unquote comprehension problem. They don't understand what they're reading, or their writing doesn't make sense. But it's so much more nuanced than that. And is it because the students have a lack of background knowledge to understand a text? Do they lack vocabulary to understand a text or express themselves? Did they not understand the meaning of one word in a sentence? And this goes for on the reading end too, which just makes the whole thing fall apart. So when we think about comprehension, it doesn't begin at a book or passage or paragraph level or even sentence level. It begins at the word level. And ding dong, there's our vocabulary, right? So we have this meaning processor in our brains that needs to be activated in order to make sense of a word. And if I think about an upper elementary teacher or even beyond that, and they task students to write an entire paragraph or story or essay right off the bat, and they get a mishmash of content, students can't write an essay if they can't write a sentence. And students can't write a sentence until they can comprehend the components of a sentence and orally speak that sentence out loud. And if we think about the components of structured literacy, it's diagnostic and explicit and systematic and cumulative. And this holds true for reading and writing. So essentially, students first need to understand the basics of a sentence before they can tackle the more complex ones. So it might start out with those simple sentences, right? The lion roars. And then we're infusing grammar instruction with sentence expansion to generate the who, what, when, where, why type sentences. The ferocious lion roars loudly in the vast savanna at dawn, asserting its dominance over the territory. Like, you're hitting on all of those components. And, we use these terms, grammar and vocabulary, and a lot of educators think that it's its own part of the literacy block, but really everything's so deeply interconnected. It's important to infuse it all together. So when you're teaching writing, you're teaching grammar. When you're teaching writing, you're teaching vocabulary. And other types of sentence structures too. So let's revise that mentor from before. The lion roars loudly. Maybe you're teaching into appositives. And an appositive is that noun or noun phrase that explains the noun or pronoun that comes before it. So first we would teach our students what an appositive is, help them identify that noun, guide them in telling them something about that noun. And we then have the lion, a majestic and ferocious beast, roars loudly. And there you have a beautiful complex sentence. Another thing we could do is use compound sentences, right? Where we're connecting to independent clauses with an and or a but or a so. And we have the ferocious lion roars loudly and the sound echoes across the savannah. So what happens when the word level comprehension isn't there? The whole meaning falls apart. And having a strong vocabulary allows students to grasp the meanings of the individual words and how they fit into the larger scheme of sentence structures. But there's this reciprocal relationship that it helps also create more sophisticated sentences using these grammatical constructions and connectors. So as the vocabulary grows, they feel more comfortable experimenting with different sentence patterns, which ultimately it just enhances everything all around.
Yeah, and what you're saying about the vocabulary and the grammar being taught within the context of the writing piece is so important. And teachers modeling exactly what it looks like in their writing and then having students play with it in their own writing, that's where we're really going to see that growth in their vocabulary, their sentence writing, and their writing overall. And I was actually just modeling a lesson for this a couple of weeks ago because we had some teachers who wanted to see what does it look like to teach a grammatical concept in the context of, in this case, we did it as an introduction paragraph. Because a lot of times what we do is if we do model, instead of just assigning writing, we do explicitly teach writing. We focus on, introduction, body paragraphs, conclusion, revision, editing. And we're really focusing on structure, but we're missing out some of those things like grammar and vocabulary, which can fit into every single lesson and can really be customized to what your students need, which is beautiful when that starts working together. So I completely agree. And vocabulary should be in both reading and writing when you're teaching. That should be a big focus. And another thing I want to note too is talking about background knowledge. Our students really do need to be introduced to a lot of the topics. So if they are writing about reading, we need to read it together first. We need to make sure that they can make those connections. They have the right background knowledge. If they don't, then we're front loading that. And then we also need to make sure that our students are able to pinpoint some of the vocabulary, figure out what it means, figure out how to use it in a sentence, and then they can better use it in their writing. So instead of just handing our students a piece of reading and saying, write about it, like they might do on the test, we want to start by introducing the topic, having discussion, having them ask and answer questions before, we're actually getting them into writing it. Because when they get to the writing part, if they don't feel like they're an expert at it, they're really going to struggle to have a complex writing piece, especially in the upper grades.
Yeah, absolutely.
So as far as outside of including just vocabulary inside the lessons, are there any other techniques or strategies that teachers can use to help students expand their vocabulary, and especially our English language learners, because I know those are the students that really need extra vocabulary support? Any strategies that you could share there would be very helpful.
Yeah. So one simple shift that teachers can do to help students expand their vocabulary is a playful one, but it's just to be more intentional with our own word choice, using more mature language. And before, when we talked about pragmatics, our language with students and even coworkers, it tends to be casual and conversational. So we want to expose students to interesting words and provoke those rich conversations. But we have to be intentional about it. So instead of line up at the door, maybe we say, please form a queue in an orderly manner, right? Instead of throw that in the trash, maybe we say, can you dispose of that in the waste receptacle? So I usually recommend finding a handful of commands that we use regularly and simply using a synonym regularly. And once your students notice that new word, then they start to change. Then you can start to change up the command and choose some new words, right? But, this is the incidental way that we're teaching vocabulary. We do have to be intentional with explicit instruction as well. And one thing that I am huge proponent of is tapping into morphology instruction across the grades. And when it comes to teaching affixes, I always say that when you teach one word, you actually teach 10. So essentially, you're helping students build these networks of words. So say we have that base infer, right? It becomes infers, inferred, inferring, inference, inferences, inferable, inferential. Then we tap into roots like Latin and Greek, and you teach one base element, you actually help unlock the meaning to hundreds of words, like the Latin root rupt, right, which means to burst. And we have disrupt, interrupt, corrupt, abrupt, erupt, bankrupt, rupture. Add the affixes, disrupts, turns into that whole example like before, right? We have disrupt, disruption, disruptive, disruptively. So this is such a powerful way to just grow our network of words. And I could go on, but another way that we can expand vocabulary is to utilize semantic mapping. And when we have students create a semantic map, we're looking at the different facets of a word. And now often with our teacher hats, you think of that four-square graphic organizer, but it doesn't always have to be the case. And the main objective is to know a word more deeply by exploring different potential semantic fields like definitions and parts of speech, pictures and symbols, multiple meanings, shades of meanings, synonyms and antonyms, examples and non-examples. And we could do semantic mapping in partnerships, small group, or even whole class with thoughtful conversations with or without the paper. And with our ELL students in mind, I always find it most powerful to use visuals when we are tapping into vocabulary. And just a tip of the hat back to morphology again, if your ELLs happen to be Spanish speakers and your vocabulary word is Latin based, chances are it's a cognate because, it's Latin in origin and they might have a similar word in their language that they can tap into their meaning processor in their original language with. But in terms of visuals, we always talk about multisensory learning and the mind automatically goes to shaving cream and hair gel and phonics instruction, right? But it's just engaging multiple senses simultaneously. And when we can utilize visuals for vocabulary instruction, you are bringing the word to life because you can't always experience a word, but you can see it. So for example, if we have the word disruptive and it's a kid like being crazy in the classroom, it's kind of painting a picture for people to experience the word in a different kind of way.
Yeah, and I think that's a useful strategy for all of our students. And we definitely can use that to help our English language learners, but it doesn't mean that it's not going to help the other students because we do have so many visual learners. And there's also so many learning disabilities where that visual really helps, as well as having something hands-on to work with. So I love those ideas. That's perfect. And the answer is probably the same to this one for parents, but we do have some parents who follow us and listen in. So for the parents who maybe don't really understand morphology, what ideas do you have for them, or what can they do to learn a little bit more to help support their child's vocabulary growth at home?
Yeah, don't shy away from using interesting words. I have two daughters, 4.5 and 16 months. And when my older one was even smaller, my husband used to laugh at me at some of the language I'd use with her. But then he saw, wow, like this actually works. And just a couple examples. And honestly, it's nothing revolutionary, but even eating meals after saying that was yummy, I might also say, that was delicious. Wasn't it scrumptious? Right. And at 2 years old, my pancakes were scrumptious. Right. And at the park, wow, you're being really adventurous climbing that rock wall. How brave of you. At the beach, oh my goodness, isn't the water frigid today? It's so cold. And notice I didn't just use the interesting language. I paired it with a synonym that they already knew. And it's almost like intentionally pairing it with a context clue for them. And it really helps bridge that connection for them more quickly. And kids are like sponges. They truly are. And I think as parents, we think we have to get the workbooks and the flashcards. But really, it's about having the rich conversations and using rich language to build up that student vocabulary and encouraging curiosity about words. And the other piece of advice I'd like to offer is to read aloud to your children, even when they're old enough to do it on their own. So in the book, Shifting the Balance for grades 3 to 5, in the vocabulary chapter, actually, Cunningham, Perkins, and Yates, they share this really interesting research study that outlines how many rare words are in printed materials versus spoken language. And children's books have almost double the amount of low frequency, complex, rare words than a conversation between, two college educated adults. And so simply the act of reading, it offers this incidental exposure sometimes when, you can't go or you could go the extra mile even talking about these interesting words that show up. And that's even more high impact.
Yeah, I think that's really important to know, because I was just reading, not that same research article, but I was reading research last week on how audiobooks help kids build vocabulary, which is similar to them being read to in the classroom, as well as they've done studies in the past where they've had an adult talk to a child and compare that to a child like watching the same lesson on a computer, and that face-to-face interaction of the adult speaking was where they saw their vocabulary and their reading and their writing skills grow, which I think is so interesting. I'll link to that book in the show notes because that's a great one. And then I'll try to find the study that I was just reading and share that. But I was actually pulling up that study because there was a heated debate in one of my reading Facebook groups, adult reading groups, because I'm a big reader, about whether or not audiobooks are really reading. And I was personally attacked. I do both. I read on my Kindle and I listen to audiobooks, but it felt so personal to me because my son listens to audiobooks and they're just so much easier for him because he has dyslexia. And so he gets excited about reading. His vocabulary is incredible. It's just the encoding and decoding that he struggles with. So there's so much out there that really shows that reading to children is so important. So we can't let that go even in older grades. We can't just think it's like a fluff activity. And I know we don't have much time, but it is essential.
Yeah, I know. And I have heard that too. And I too would have been offended because I am not an Audible girl. For my personal books, I am audiobooks. And then for professional books, I like the hard copy. But, busy adult life too. You got to consume what you can when you can. Sometimes it's got to be in the car.
Exactly. And you're still learning and growing. And no matter what you're reading, even if it's a book that's just fun and it's not really a professional book, you're still building vocabulary as an adult. I actually am in a group where there's a lot of people who on their Kindles are really highlighting words that they've never seen before, and still in their 30s and 40s and beyond are still learning new vocabulary through reading or even just listening to the book. So it is so important to remember that just reading on its own is going to help us grow in our vocabulary. So I think that's, I don't know why people are debating what mode you do it in, but I'm happy that my kids are reading in any form. And same goes with students too. I think Audible is great. So we talked a little bit about parents. We talked about what teachers can do. Is there if there's a teacher who's just completely overwhelmed by this conversation, or a parent who's overwhelmed by this conversation, where can they find you to learn more about the topic and take the time to really dig into it?
Yeah. So you can find me on Instagram at Michelle_the Colorful Classroom, or through my website, michelleandthecolorfulclassroom.com. I'm most active on those two platforms. Platform, not really a website, but blogging wise. So email me, shoot me a DM. I am happy to engage and talk further. And I look forward to connecting with your audience. And thank you so much for this chance to dig into vocabulary a bit. I know this was a tiny little bit, but we can always go deeper, and I'm always happy to.
Yeah, thank you. We'll have to have you on again. I feel like there's so many different topics we can talk about under that umbrella of vocabulary. But I think it's just great to have that general overview to remind teachers that it is important to make sure we have it in our reading and writing lesson. So I really appreciate you coming on, and definitely we'll have to have you back to get more in depth on this topic. And if anyone has a specific topic or questions about vocabulary, they can email me too, and I'll compile that and we'll just figure out what the topic should be next time.
There you go.
Great. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it, Michelle.
Thank you.